Well, good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our presentation. This is ISO 9001:2015, an introduction to the world's most popular standard. My name is Joseph Krolikowski. I am the QMS Program Manager for PJR. A couple of notes for everyone. All of you are on mute, but we absolutely want to address your questions, so please utilize the question portion of the dashboard. We will address questions at the end of our presentation today. One of the more common questions that we get is whether or not the presentation will be available after we are finished. We do make all of our webinars available in two ways. Firstly, if you'd like to get a copy of the slides, they will be available for download shortly after we are finished. And if you'd like to rewatch this webinar with the voiceover, we do post all of our webinars to our YouTube channel, and that can also be accessed via our website. Just look for the link entitled Previously Recorded Webinars. Now, our topics for today, we're going to be kind of unpacking what is ISO 9001 and what is its intention by way of the scope statement. We're going to talk a little bit about where ISO standards come from, and we're going to introduce an item that is referred to as Annex SL and kind of unpack how this has an impact on ISO 9001 and many, many other standards. We'll talk briefly about ISO 9001, kind of cover to cover, give you a sense of what's where. Then the kind of the primary thrust of this presentation, the key ideas of ISO 9001, try to give you a high-level view of what its key themes are. I also have an update for you on the newest version of ISO 9001 and what you can expect there. We'll have a couple of concluding remarks, and then we will take your questions. Now, ISO 9001's official title is Quality Management Systems Requirements. It is intended as a standard for a company's quality management. And obviously, there are other standards that talk about environmental management, information security management, and so forth. ISO 9001 is all about quality management. And you can really kind of unpack what ISO 9001 is all about by reviewing the scope statement, which appears in section 1. Now, this scope statement, word for word, has been the scope statement going all the way back 3 editions now. This has been the scope in the 2015 edition, the 2008 edition, and the 2000 edition. And it states that this standard is specifying requirements for a quality management system when an organization needs to demonstrate its ability to consistently provide products and services that meet customer and applicable statutory and regulatory requirements and aim to enhance customer satisfaction through the effective application of the system, including processes for improvement of the system and the assurance of conformity to customer and applicable statutory and regulatory requirements. Now, that's a whole lot of words. So what I'd like to do is kind of unpack this thing piece by piece. So let's start at the very front. This international standard specifies requirements for a quality management system. Now, this opening statement establishes a key aspect for the entire standard, and that is ISO 9001 is not a product standard. It does not tell you how to manufacture your product. That is still very much up to the individual organization to figure out how they are going to make their products, control their products, etc. ISO 9001 is all about a quality management system. Where an organization needs to demonstrate its ability to consistently provide products and services. Now, I've placed emphasis on this business of and services. Now, going way back, ISO 9001 was originally positioned as something that was going to be primarily for companies that manufactured tangible products. Now, As the years have gone by, there have been more and more industries that are service-based that have found benefit in implementing ISO 9001. So the framers of the standard felt that the standard itself needed to be written from an inclusive perspective, that it was going to address products and standards. And indeed, it does that throughout the ISO 9001 standard. It references products and standards side by side, or services rather, excuse me, side by side. Meeting customer and applicable statutory and regulatory requirements with the aim of enhancing customer satisfaction. Now, this is probably the central cornerstone of ISO 9001. This whole idea that the certified organization needs to be tuned in and receptive and responsive to the needs of their customers. Now, that concept, that idea, actually goes all the way back to the original edition of ISO 9001 that came out in 1988. Through the effective application of the system, including processes for improvement and the assurance of conformity to customer statutory and regulatory requirements. Now, these final statements acknowledge the ongoing nature of the quality management system. It's not intended to be something that you implement and forget. In fact, it's not supposed to be add-on at all. It's supposed to be how you operate your organization. It's not something that you take the books down twice a year and blow the dust off of them. This is supposed to be part and parcel of how you run your business. And the fact that they mention the term improvement foreshadows the importance of improvement within ISO 9001 and the expectations for improvement as a discipline, as a concept within your organization. So now that we've unpacked a little bit about what ISO 9001 is all about, let's talk about where these standards come from. Now, ISO, when it was originally coined, when the phrase was originally coined, it didn't stand for anything initially. It was taken from the Greek word isos, which means equal or same. And later, they did use the term to mean something, and it is the International Organization for Standardization. Now, they are based in Geneva, Switzerland, and you may be wondering, well, why isn't it IOS? Well, it's because it's based in a European language where it does translate ISO. So that's where the letters ISO comes from. Now, each of the standards that ISO publishes is assigned to a committee. Now, if it's intended to be a standard for certification, it's typically assigned to a technical committee. Now, Technical Committee 176 is the committee that is assigned to ISO 9001. Now, there are voting members and there are members at large. Now, the membership on TC 176 includes representation from each of the major industrialized nations. Now, here in the United States, our representatives to TC 176 come from the American National Standards Institute. Now, to understand the ordering of the clauses and to get a feel for where the content in ISO 9001 comes from, we have to understand a key document that was developed 3 years before the 2015 version was published, and that is Annex SL. Now, Annex SL has been referred to as the high-level outline, Annex XL. What Annex SL is, it is part of a larger publication called Directives Part 1, Consolidated ISO Supplement Procedures Specific to ISO. This is a self-imposed set of requirements for writing standards that the ISO agreed upon back in 2012. Now, Annex SL, incidentally, is public domain. You can look at it for free right on the ISO website. So if you Google Directives Part 1 Annex SL, you can read the text for yourself. You can actually download a copy of it if you're so inclined. Now, as I said, Annex SL was first published back in 2012. It has actually since been revised a bit. It is a 10-section blueprint for writing the ISO family of standards. Now, what it is intended to do, among other things, is to promote utilization of common terms and core definitions. So, for example, most of the standards, all of the standards actually, use the phrase organization as a call out to the company that's certified. Well, if there's a common definition for that term, then all of the standards have to fall in line with that common definition. So that's one example. Common terms with core definitions. That's one of the big reasons why Annex SL exists in the first place. Now, all of the standards that are published by ISO have completed their transition to the Annex SL format. Now, there are some standards that are not officially ISO publications where they deviate from this. One good example of that is the ISO 1345 standard. 1345 is not an ISO publication that utilizes Annex SL. That comes from a whole separate set of requirements. Now, here's an example of how Annex SL works. Now, on the left, I have the Annex SL text that appears in section 9.2.1, which has to do with internal auditing. Now, on the right, I've got ISO 9001:2015, clause 921. Now, as you can see, there are parts of Annex SL where there are X's, and the intent is that the writers of the standard are going to fill in the appropriate term, in this case, quality. And there are other circumstances where there are options. For example, in subclause A2, they've used the requirements of this international standard as opposed to the requirements of this technical specification or this part of ISO such and so. So this is an example of how Annex SL then feeds into what becomes ISO 9001. Now, Annex SL includes 7 auditable sections, sections 4 through 10. So we're very quickly here, we're going to go through the content of these sections by way of the section titles. Now, in section 4, it's called Context of the Organization. Obviously, there's some very high-level stuff here. This is where you're developing your scope, what your processes are, figuring out who your interested parties are, and so forth. Obviously, the high-level items here. Section 5 is called Leadership and Commitment. This is where you find the requirements for the quality policy, defining responsibilities and authorities, figuring out what the roles are within the organization. In section, and also I want to mention there's roles of management that are unpacked in section 5, hence the title, leadership. In section 6, called planning, section 6 is made up of 2 key parts. We have the risk requirement, which then flows into several other areas. And this is also where we find the quality objectives requirement. This idea that you have to develop measurable goals for your processes kind of comes home primarily in section 6. Section 7 is called support. There's a number of requirements in play here. We have competency requirements here. Those of you that have measurement devices, your calibration requirements are found in section 7. The requirements related to what the standard calls documented information, so your record retention, your document revision controls, and so forth. All of these things are provided in section 7. Section 8 is called operation, and section 8 can kind of be thought of as the day-to-day activities of the company. So this is going to include things like your order entry processes, your design processes, if you have product design, your interfaces with your supply base are going to be found in Section 8. Core production controls are going to be mandated by Section 8, and so forth. A lot of content in Section 8. A good audit is going to be primarily spent ensuring that Section 8 is being enforced appropriately. And then the standard concludes with sections 9 and 10. Section 9 is called performance evaluation. It includes areas like customer satisfaction, internal auditing, management review. And then in section 10, we have requirements related to continual improvement and corrective action. Now, apart from the auditable sections, there are multiple non-auditable sections, and I'd like to take a couple of minutes now and give you a sense of what is in those sections. Now, we begin with section 0.1, general introduction. Now, this provides kind of an overview statement, some intent on who the standard benefits. There's an introduction to some of the high-level ideas like risk-based thinking and Plan, Do, Check, Act. And then we have an official introduction to the 4 terms and some unpacking of what is meant by the term shall. Shall obviously means a mandatory requirement. Should, a recommendation. May and can, both talking about possibilities, permissions, and so forth. The primary term that's in play here, obviously, is the term shall. The introduction section continues with the 7 quality management principles, which are listed, but officially are unpacked in the ISO 9000 document. ISO 9000 is called Fundamentals and Vocabulary. We're going to have one more reference to that item a little bit later. But these 7 quality management principles, these are positioned as the higher level ideas that impact the development of ISO 9001. In section 0.3, we learn a bit more about the intent with the process approach and the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle. There is actually a graphic that appears that kind of gives you a tie-in between the clause numbers and the PDCA cycle. 033 talks about risk-based thinking. Again, provides a definition and a more in-depth explanation of the importance of that concept. 0.4 talks about the relationship between ISO 9001 and its 2 supplemental documents, the 9000 Fundamentals and Vocabulary and the 9004 Guidelines on Improvement supplement. Then we have sections 1, 2, and 3. Now, we've already unpacked section 1, the scope statement. In section 2, there is a normative reference clause, and currently there is only one document that is listed as normative reference, and that's ISO 9000. Now, as I mentioned, ISO 9000 is called Fundamentals and Vocabulary, and the intent of listing it in section 2 with a normative reference is that all of the definitions that appear in ISO 9000 are binding in the context of an audit. So in other words, like I said, the ISO 9000 provides an official definition of the term organization, the official term conformity, non-conformity, and so forth. These are binding definitions by way of ISO 9000 being listed as a normative reference document in section 2. Section 3 is entitled Terms and Definitions. Currently, there are no other terms and definitions. Basically, all of the terms that need to be defined are in the ISO 9000. Now, that may change in the future. It's possible that future editions of ISO 9001 will have the need for one or more official definitions that aren't available in ISO 9000, but currently Section 3 is without content. That's not the case in many other ISO published standards. Section 3 at times can have dozens of documented or defined terms. We've already looked at sections 4 through 10, so let's move on to the annexes. Now, Annex A is it's an interesting a bit of the standard. It is 8 parts of informative content. And what's in here is guidance. Now you have to understand that 10 years ago, when the standard was published, this was brand new in terms of the standard having guidance baked right into it. This was a new thing for ISO 9001. Now there are, as I said, 8 pieces of this guidance. In A1, there is a section titled Structure and Terminology. And what it basically says here is that for an organization to implement a quality management system, they don't have to number their procedures or their forms to match ISO 9001. And they don't even have to use the terms that appear in ISO 9001. So for example, if you want to refer to the folks you buy from as suppliers, you can do so. You don't have to start referring to them as external providers, just because that's the term that's used in ISO 9001. In A2, there is a more thorough unpacking of the intent in referencing products and services side by side, and we've sort of already talked about that. In A3, there is a more in-depth discussion of the term interested parties and what the intent is in referring to them as interested parties. Risk-based thinking appears in section A4. It is emphasized in A4 that an organization does not have to have a formal risk management process. That had been the misunderstanding 10 years ago when the standard was first published, that there was suddenly going to be an expectation for a formal risk management process. That is not the case, and A4 remains where that is explained. In A5, there is some discussion about how at the time, 10 years ago, they were abandoning the phrase exclusions. And these concepts are now understood as non-applicables. In A6, there's some discussion of what is meant by the phrase documented information. In A7, there's some unpacking of the term organizational knowledge. This was another new concept at the time that the 2015 standard was published. And so A7 was intended to give some basis for understanding what they meant by that. And then in A8, we have a special section on externally provided products and services. And what it does well in A8 is unpack what is meant by an external provider. What is that term meant to mean? Annex B is an extensive discussion on the relationship between ISO 9001 and its various other publications, 9004, 10001, and so forth. And the standard concludes with a bibliography. So there are 5 key ideas that are found in ISO 9001. So if you're brand new to ISO 9001, and obviously that's the intended audience for this webinar, there are 5 key concepts that I want you to bear in mind as you read through the standard and as you work to implement the standard. And those ideas are scope, processes, accountability, effectiveness, and improvement. So let's start with scope. Now, I mentioned earlier that scope is a very early concept. It comes in section 4.3. And the standard mandates that you develop what is referred to as a scope statement. Now, a scope statement represents the extent and boundaries of your quality management system. It represents what is it that I'm trying to get ISO 9001 certified for. Now, I've provided 3 examples here. just 3 random examples. Design, fabrication, and assembly of collapsible tripods, distribution of fasteners, plating, heat treating, sorting of metal stampings. These are all companies with a tangible product, but as you can see, there are different things going on in these 3 companies. But you can read these scope statements and very quickly you understand what it is these companies do. Now, the scope statement that you develop, ideally, not mandatorily, but ideally, will eventually be the same as what's going to be shown on the ISO 9001:2015 certificate that you get from PJR. Now, again, I want to emphasize that that is not mandatory. Some organizations really want to bake a lot of detail into their scope statement, and you're allowed to do that. But when it comes time for us to issue our certificate, there are requirements that we have to meet in terms of coverage of that scope statement. Now, having said that, do not list an item on your scope that will not be available for audit. So for example, if you have field installation and you're installing equipment in a government office, something that you will never be able to get clearance for the auditor to assess, well, we can't certify you for what we can't see. So leave those kinds of things out of your certification scope statement. Same principle if you've got new equipment that isn't up and running yet. Again, we cannot certify what we can't audit. That's a key thing for you to bear in mind. Also, I encourage you to be careful about being too wordy in your scope statement. And speaking now more specifically about what's intended to appear on your certificate scope statement. So let's consider a circumstance where an organization has laser cutting, water jet cutting, progressive die cutting, plating, heat treating, and distribution of flanges, springs, shims, bolts, and barrels. If that's your scope statement, we have to audit all of that stuff. Our audit has to include laser cutting and water jet cutting and progressive die cutting and so forth. And our audit also has to make sure that we're sampling flanges and springs and shims and bolts and so forth. So you can do this, but it's possible that your audit's going to be longer because you've asked us to certify you for this long mouthful of stuff that you want on your certificate. Okay, moving on to key idea number 2, processes. This is another concept that gets mentioned very early. It's actually in section 4.4. Now, the requirement is that the organization has to determine what their processes are and how they interface with each other. Now, 4.4 says that a quality management system is made up of processes. Now, this is a very key idea, this whole idea of concept, of processes. This is such an important idea that we actually have a whole separate webinar on it. So if you've never seen our webinar, The Interaction of Processes and Its Importance to a Successful Audit, I encourage you to check it out because that is a critical webinar for getting your arms around what the expectations are related to processes. Now, the idea of processes, it cascades throughout the whole standard. Now I've pulled a handful of examples. This is not all of it by any measure. The process approach is mentioned first in section 511D. Quality objectives being aligned to processes, 621. Are staff competent for processes, 712, 716. Are you controlling external processes, 8.4. Are you ensuring effective infrastructure for your processes, 713. So when you develop these processes, we encourage you to make your processes as personal and unique to your business as possible. You know your company. You should know what your processes are. This should not be mysterious. And I encourage you, do not just name your processes after the sections of the standard, because that potentially that's meaningless. You definitely want your process names to be reflective of who you are as an organization. Moving on to key idea number 3, accountability. Now, ISO 9001 demands inclusion of all the persons that fall within the scope of the system. Now, that is most directly addressed in section 511. 511 says that top management needs to make itself accountable for the effectiveness of the quality management system. Now, that was a new idea when this standard was published 10 years ago, this idea of accountability. And this is a concept that then cascades into other areas. In 8.6, it demands that product release records have to name names. So we need to know who authorized this product to ship. Complaints have to be responded to with corrective action, section 10.2. Excuse me, I should say appropriate systemic action. 5.3 says that you need to define roles, responsibilities, and authorities. 522B says that people need to be cognizant of the quality policy. And 7.3 says they need to understand how they are contributing to the effectiveness of the quality management system. So I want you to remember that ISO 9001 is an inclusive standard. Again, it's rooted in that scope statement, but it is an inclusive standard. Everyone is part of the team that's making ISO 9001 work for your organization. Key idea number 4 is effectiveness. ISO 9001 has numerous requirements that require you to measure the effectiveness of something. And the idea is that you should know at any given time how well or how poorly things are going in your operation. So let's take a look at the clauses where this is mentioned. Now, the basic idea comes in section 441C, which again, that's very early in the auditable content. It states that the organization needs to determine and apply the criteria and methods needed to ensure the effective operation and control of processes. And it's specified that this is going to include monitoring, measurement, and performance indicators. Obviously, that's a very high-level statement, but it gets more thoroughly unpacked in other parts of the standard. So again, here's a long list. As you can see, this is a very long list of all the different ways in which you are expected to measure the effectiveness of what's going on within your quality management system. We have things like tracking quality objectives, 621, performing product and service inspection, 8.6, measuring customer satisfaction, 912, doing the internal audit process, 9.2, having management review meetings, 9.3, and so forth. Again, this idea of effectiveness is pervasive, and it's part of the larger quality culture, if you will, that exists within ISO 9001. Now, the final cornerstone concept that I want to talk about today is improvement. Now, improvement, the current rendering of improvement, this was actually, originally the concept was called continual improvement or continuous improvement. Now, what they did with the improvement concept is they kind of expanded it a bit. They went beyond just continuous improvement and added in concepts like reactive changes and breakthroughs and so forth. And the idea that improvement was something that should be pervasive throughout the quality management system, not just something that you work on from time to time. Now, the primary clause for improvement is section 10.1, where it states that you need to determine and select opportunities for improvement and implement the actions needed, both to meet customer requirements and to enhance customer satisfaction. Now, with that in mind, improvement is mentioned as a concept in multiple places. Now, I've listed a few of these here. In 4.4, it says that you need to continually improve your management system. In 5.1.1, it says that the management team, the leadership team, needs to promote improvement. 5.2.1, it says that your quality policy has to address continual improvement. 5.3c, it says that responsibilities need to include reporting on opportunities for improvement. 6.1.1d talks about the relationship between risk and improvement, how these two concepts are very tightly linked. 7.1.1 says that resources should contribute to improvement. 7.3, people that work for the organization need to be aware of how their efforts impact improvement. And 9.3.2f, your management review meetings should include discussion of opportunities for improvement. So putting all of that aside, I'm sure several of you on our call today are wondering what is going on with the new version of ISO 9001. As obviously, the current edition is almost 10 years old at this point. It'll be hitting its 10th birthday in September. And there's been some chatter about a new version. Well, I can confirm that TC 176 is indeed working on the new version as we speak. We don't currently have a firm timeline. There is a committee draft that's been distributed amongst committee members. To my knowledge, it is not available for purchase by the public, and thus we have very little detail in terms of what's actually coming. The only change that we can confirm right now, because it's applicable right now, is the change related to climate change and how this is now part of the standard. So let's unpack this concept just a bit. Now, this actually goes back a little over a year. In February of last year, ISO took a very unusual step. They published an amendment to ISO 9001 without reissuing the standard in whole. Now, the amendment is actually available for free. If you go to the ISO website, you can download the amendment yourself and have that. And by having that and your copy of ISO 9001, you have the current complete version of the standard. Now, the amendment specified two clausal updates. So let's take a look at what these intended updates were. Firstly, in section 4.1, it states now that you shall determine whether climate change is a relevant issue. You're required to determine your internal and external issues. They are now saying you need to consider climate change as a potential relevant issue. Then in section 4.2, there is a note that indicates that relevant interested parties can have requirements related to climate change. So in other words, you could have a customer, you could have a partner company, all kinds of possibilities in terms of climate change requirements coming from some of these folks. Now, the most common question that we've gotten about this is, what do these climate change updates mean for me? How does this impact me? Well, for that, we turn to the IAF, the International Accreditation Forum. And they actually published some guidance on how companies like PJR are supposed to audit these new clauses. Now, I've provided the extract here. I'm not going to read this to you word for word. What I am going to provide you is a summary. Basically, what the IAF has told us is that we are expecting that you have considered climate change as a potential relevant issue to your quality management system and that you've acted accordingly. Now, also, it is entirely possible for you to conclude that climate change has no bearing on you or your interested parties. We will accept that as a conclusion, but we do need to see evidence of how you reached that decision. So you can expect this to be asked about, if it hasn't been asked already, as part of your audit process. And so we expect you to have some sort of response ready for us. ISO 9001 remains the world's most utilized standard. There are just over 900,000 registered companies worldwide. Any organization that wants to get certified to ISO 9001 would do well to bear in mind the big picture of what ISO 9001 2015 is trying to promote. Now, if you're ready for a deeper dive, we do have a clause-by-clause course. So if you want to be taken through the ISO 9001 standard word for word and have it explained, we have a free course for that. If you go on our website, just look for the link entitled Training, and you'll find ISO 9001 2015 clause by clause. And again, that course is 100% free. I'd like to invite you to tune in for one of our other webinars. We do have a supplemental presentation to this one that you've just finished. It's called ISO 9001 2015, Anticipating Auditor Expectations in Key Areas. It's an unpacking of some of the more common issues that come up in audits and what our expectations are. I've already talked about our interaction of processes and its importance to a successful audit presentation. Lastly, I'd like to mention your ongoing relationship with PJR. Now, this is a somewhat newer presentation. It talks about what to do when things change in your system, and it also includes an in-depth review of the dispute process. And we have webinars on a variety of other topics, things like Stage 1 auditing, ITF 16949, and so forth. If you'd like to be kept informed of the latest news automatically, the best way for you to do that is to visit our website at www.pjr.com. Go to the very bottom of the page and enter your email address, and then click subscribe. You will be opted in for automatic updates on important news related to the standards, upcoming webinars, and other helpful points of information. I do thank you all for your time and attention. I hope this presentation has been helpful. I'm going to unlock the question portion of the dashboard if any of our attendees today have any questions. Okay, well, very good. Well, again, thank you all, and everyone have a great day. Thank you.